Me and my wife have been listening to your channel since last year, and we think we might have a story that would fit well with your channel. It's been a few years since we moved out of our starter home, but back when we first moved in, we had this real nice elderly widower for a neighbor. He was retired and mostly spent his time in his backyard tending to the flower beds his wife had left behind. We had a lovely view of it from our bedroom, and most days, you'd be able to see him out there, preening and nourishing the plants and generally being the most wholesome person ever. But then this one day, my husband called me upstairs and I found him staring out of the window over at our neighbor's backyard. I asked him what he was looking at and he just pointed in silent confusion, so I walk over towards the window to take a look for myself. Our neighbor was standing right in the middle of this big, perfectly trimmed lawn, and he was just slamming a shovel into the grass over and over again, obviously intent and digging a pretty big hole. It was weird, but after some discussion, we decided that there was obviously some kind of method to his madness, so to speak. He was probably planning on installing a bird feeder or something else that would require digging a hole into the lawn. The next day, my husband calls me upstairs again, only this time, he had this weird urgency in his voice. I go upstairs, figuring it had something to do with the neighbor's lawn, and when I look out of the window, I see something that sends a chill right through me. The hole that our neighbor was digging was considerably larger now, and it wasn't some round pit fit for a bird bath or squirrel feeder or something. It was quite clearly a grave. You might be wondering how we knew that, how we could tell the difference between a grave and just any other kind of pit or trench that might have some perfectly normal purpose of function. But the big clue was the wooden cross our neighbor had stacked on the ground at one end. Almost immediately, my husband goes over to check if he's okay, and I had to wait like 5 or 10 minutes for him to come back. The moment he walks through the door, I ask him what was said, and he just sat down on the couch and began shaking his head, telling me he didn't know. I was so frustrated. I mean, how does he go over and just not ask about the grave that had been dug in the backyard? But my husband said that he didn't want to clue him into the fact that we'd basically been spying on him, and said that when push came to shove, he got really creeped out and just couldn't bring himself to ask. He said there was something different about our nice, friendly neighbor, that he didn't seem so nice and friendly anymore. He was normally all smiles and handshakes, full of small talk and compliments and the like. But that time he knocked on his door, my husband said that there was like a darkness about him and it left him really, really unsettled. He reassured me by saying that we'd keep an eye on the whole thing, and if we suddenly saw him dragging a body into the grave or whatever, we'd just call the cops. This was on a Saturday morning, and the rest of the weekend, my husband basically camped out in our bedroom, watching our neighbor's backyard for anything suspicious. It was a Sunday afternoon when he called me up into the bedroom again, and that time, we could see that our neighbor was quite clearly digging a second hole. You have to understand what a weird position this put us in. I mean, it's not illegal to dig holes in your backyard, and it wasn't like he'd taken the time to fill the first one. But if he really was planning on doing something hideous, we couldn't be the people to say that we watched him prepare for it and didn't do anything about it. In the end, I convinced my husband to call the cops, saying it was either him or me, so he called. I watched him make the call, and I watched him tell whoever was on the other end that he was concerned at our neighbor's behavior because he was clearly digging graves in his backyard. Like I said, he'd obviously yet to put anything inside of them. At least we hadn't seen him put anything inside of them, but his behavior was obviously very, very creepy, so we thought we'd run it by the cops to see what they had to say. My husband is all like, yeah, okay, thanks for a few minutes. And when he hangs up, he tells me that they're sending a patrol car over so some cops could ask him a few questions. We didn't want to make it obvious that it was us that had called them, but we still wanted to know what our neighbor had to say about the whole thing. So when we saw the cops pulling up outside his house, we went down into our garage and listened in. One of the walls of our garage was maybe only a few feet away from our neighbor's front door, and if you opened up one of the windows, you could hear almost everything that was being said. So We do just that, and we listen as the cops tell the guy that they had a complaint about some strange behavior, and if they could head inside of our neighbor's house to take a look around. I don't even know what we were expecting here, but it definitely wasn't a really defiant sounding, "You guys got a warrant," coming from our normally friendly neighbor. We figured the cops might have one, but turns out we didn't know squat about the law and that it takes way longer to get one than just a simple phone call from some concerned neighbors. The cops ended up leaving, but as soon as they did, we basically ran back upstairs to see if our neighbor was going to do anything like remove the wooden cross, fill the graves in, or if he'd just carry on digging the second one out as if he wasn't bothered by the cops having knocked on his door. My husband was the first one to the window, but as soon as he looks out, he turns around again, white as a sheet, and says, "He's looking at us." I couldn't resist. I know I should have just taken my husband's word for it and shouldn't have looked, but I just couldn't help myself. He was right. The guy was standing in his backyard right next to the graves, and he was looking up at our window with this angry look on his face. I tried to act as naturally as possible, feigning ignorance to the whole thing, so I just gave him a smile and a wave, then shut the curtains to make it look like we weren't staring. But I did make sure to leave a slight crack at the edge so we could peek out and keep an eye on the whole grave situation, because by that point, it had basically become our complete obsession. The next day, when we woke up for work, not only was there another wooden cross staked into the ground at the head of the second finished grave, but our neighbor was working on a third one. Then, by the time me and husband returned home from our respective jobs, our neighbor was working on a fourth. We couldn't keep our mind off how the whole thing was going to end, and the worst thing was when we got into our heads that the guy was planning on filling the third and fourth graves with us, since he'd somehow evidently gotten a pretty good idea of who had called the cops on him. We called the cops again that evening and told them that we were seriously worried about what our neighbor was up to. And when our call was forwarded to the relevant officer, we were assured that they were in the process of getting a search warrant and that they'd revisit the guy's house the moment that it was signed by a judge. The thing was, we just didn't think that we could wait that long, and I know for a fact that some pretty awful things have happened while people have been waiting for a search warrant to be signed. It was my husband that suggested the cops get in touch with a relative of our neighbor, if they had any on record, and ask them to knock on his door to check on them before it was too late. Thankfully, we think that's exactly what happened, because after about a week of complete inactivity from our neighbor, my husband managed to catch a younger-looking person walking up to the guy's house with a set of keys in her hand. He asked if she knew anything about the guy who lived there, and she said yes, that it was her father's place, and he'd not been feeling too well recently, so he'd gone to stay with them for a while. She was just there picking up some of his clothes and stuff to take back to her place. We don't think she knew the extent of our knowledge of the situation, but my husband said she looked tired, really tired, so I figured whatever she knew about her father's state of mind had really taken it out of her. About a month later, there was a for sale sign up on the front lawn, and a full moving crew had showed up outside, boxing up the old guy's things before loading them into the back of the van. Then, a few days later, a landscaping crew came by and started filling in and patching over the graves. Let me tell you, they looked just as creeped out as we were. After that, we didn't hear anything else about it, and I understand why my husband didn't want to press the young woman for answers, since it already seemed like she was at a breaking point. Some people say it must have been kind of sad seeing an older guy losing his mind like that, but I'm not sure he was losing his mind, not in the way that people think. He seemed lucid as could be when he was talking to the cops. The way he just figured out who called them, or at least took a really good guess, that doesn't suggest a failing mind to me. All in all, it made for one of the creepiest, most unsettling experiences of my entire life, one I'll certainly never forget, and I'll always wonder, what were his intentions for those graves?
If you really like my content and want to support me, please like this video and click the subscribe button. It helps me to grow my channel and is essential in reaching a wider audience. Most of you watching my videos aren't subscribed to my channel, and that's why my animations can't reach their full potential. They aren't recommended to more people who would surely love my content as much as you do. You can always unsubscribe at any moment. Thank you in advance, and enjoy the rest of the video.
We used to have this neighbor back when I was 15, and I didn't find this out until years later, but he basically was the sole reason we ended up moving out of the house we were living in at the time. So the way my dad tells it, it all started when the guy started making something in the shed in his backyard. Obviously, he was entitled to do whatever he wanted on his property, especially during the daylight hours, but my dad said all the sawing and hammering noises were a real pain in the butt. He figured it'd only be a couple of days, but a week went by and the guy was still making all this noise in the evenings and on weekends. It went on late into the night on a bunch of different occasions, and my dad had to go over and threaten to call the cops to get him to knock it off. Seems a little extreme, I know, but Dad had already tried asking nicely and the guy was just a total jerk, so it was the only thing that seemed to work. After that, the guy kept the sawing and hammering to reasonable hours, still a pain apparently, but nothing he didn't have the right to. But then, my dad looks over the fence one day and sees the guy carrying a whole bunch of chains into the shed. Then the next thing he knows, the guy is carrying all these shackle-looking things into the shed, the kind you use to keep a person prisoner. Dad asks what he's building in there, but the guy is all, "Mind your business, mister," saying things like that. My dad is starting to get pretty nervous about the whole thing, and he's close to calling the cops because it was obviously looking incredibly shady, and maybe it'll get the guy to stop hammering and sawing all freaking day too. But still, he holds off for one night too long, and that's when he hears a scream coming from the guy's backyard. He says it was one of those screams of the blood-curdling variety, and he goes outside to listen, then hears a few more muffled sounds coming from the shed where the guy was building, whatever it was he was building in there. He tries looking over the fence to get an idea of what's going on and sees our neighbor walking out to the shed, covered in blood, with something sharp and shiny in his hand. But just before he closes the door, Dad said he caught a glimpse of someone strapped onto some kind of big wooden board. That was it. My dad runs back inside, calls the cops, and tells them something messed up is happening in our neighbor's backyard, how he had been building some kind of torture device or whatever, and how he thought he was in the process of basically murdering someone in there. The cops show up, but they don't make it into the backyard. They just drive off after talking to the guy. My dad calls the cops back and asks them what they're thinking, and they need to get into that shed right away because something unspeakable is happening in there. They tell them that they can't get into the guy's place without a warrant, that the guy had a bandaged hand and claimed the blood was because he had an accident. The cops seemed happy enough with that explanation and had gone back to their precinct. But they were in the process of getting a warrant because of my dad's claim that he'd seen a body in there, and because of how urgent it was, it might only be a few hours before they could get one signed by a judge. Then boom. The next day, the cops show back up at the guy's house at like 6 a.m., and it wakes my dad up because they were literally sawing a lock off the door to the shed. He watches all freaking morning, and get this, they carry out the body he'd seen in that shed. Only it wasn't a body. It was like one of those mannequin-type things, and it had blood all over it. The guy has actually been building some kind of torture table in his shed, only he hadn't actually done anything to anyone, so the guy ended up getting a full apology from the county after they didn't find anything to arrest him over. But still, my dad's not happy knowing he lives next to someone who'd build something like that, and after arguing back and forth with the cops about the guy's right to build some sort of weird torture table, he ends up just being like, "Screw this, we're moving." He didn't say anything to us at the time because obviously me and my sister were still young and he didn't want anything like that in our heads. But after I had moved out and my sister had graduated college, he ended up telling us at a little reunion dinner. As you can guess, our jaws were on the floor when he was telling us, as we had no idea he was anything but some annoying home improvements nerd. It came up because we were complaining about having to move schools at that age, as me and my sister both lost a bunch of good friends, and it sucked having to start at a new school right when I just started at a new one there. He figured the whole thing would be justified to us why we had to move, and honestly, I get it. I wouldn't want to live next to a freak like that, either.
Several years ago, we bought a house with a little creek running through the backyard. Who wouldn't want a house in such a tranquil setting? On the third day we owned our new home, our next-door neighbor came over and introduced herself. "Hi, my name is Ema Nasol." She greeted us cheerfully. We had an odd conversation, and when she left, hubby and I looked at each other and asked, what was that all about? That afternoon, I joked to hubby, "I can't believe I just moved next door to someone with plastic flowers in her yard." The next morning we got up, all the plastic flowers were gone. It was a Twilight Zone moment. Whether I was gardening in the backyard or front yard, Ema was soon outside striking up a conversation. She had a way of making statements that catch you off guard and beg for a reply. She managed to get a lot of personal information from me before I figured out what she was doing. Ema had several dogs, and their barking was a nuisance. Every night, no matter what time we went to bed, the dogs would start barking under our bedroom window within a minute of turning the lights out. It took us months to figure out that she was watching for our lights to go out. How creepy is that? I politely asked her to keep her dogs away from our bedroom window late at night. She put a huge grin on her face and said, "Nope, can't do that." Then the barking got worse and worse, and she stepped up the harassment several notches. I would either be polite or just put down my gardening tools and go in the house. Even though I never saw her watching me, she had ways of letting me know that she saw everything I did. I felt like I was being stalked. She never bothered my husband, and my husband didn't believe me when I told him the things she was doing and saying to me. One day, I took hubby's car somewhere, and Ema assumed I was home alone. She started in with the harassment and creepiness. When I got home, hubby was shaken. He never doubted me after that. We had a nice neighbor on the other side of us, and one day, I asked her if she ever had any problems with Ema. She unloaded stories of years of abuse. Oh swell, what have we gotten ourselves into? We finally contacted animal control and filed a complaint about the dogs barking. They asked us to keep a record of when the dog started and stopped barking. The result? They barked between 60 to 70 hours per week. After a couple of weeks, I couldn't waste any more time keeping track. Ema was not happy about the dog complaint. Her next move was to call 911 the night of February 13th. At 11:45 p.m., 2 police cruisers and 4 cops showed up at our door for a domestic violence call, courtesy of Ema. Happy Valentine's Day. Every few months, Ema would get the urge to call 911 and report me for harassing her, even though by this time, I no longer spoke to her and went inside whenever she came outside. What we didn't know then was that Ema had a wheelchair, and after she called 911, she'd get in it before the police showed up. She'd tell the cop the sob story that she was a poor, old handicapped senior citizen being brutally harassed by me. I'm 2 years younger than Ema. Yeah, I'm a senior citizen too. Then the cop would come over to our house to ream me out for being such a horrible neighbor. Since my hair isn't gray, thanks to my hairdresser, I look much younger than Ima, so the cop assumed she's much older and more vulnerable. After several episodes of this, we installed covert video cameras. 2 months after getting the cameras, Ima had a hankering for the company of a uniformed officer. After hearing her sob story, he came to our house and told us to move away and stop harassing all the neighbors. To his credit, he agreed to view the video footage. The viewing left him speechless. Not only was there no wheelchair in sight, but everything she told him that I said or did to her, she had actually said and done to me. Shortly before we got the cameras, Ima tried to run me down with her car when I was out for a walk. When a friend of hers tried the same trick, we got it on camera. I didn't have to call 911 when that happened, because Ima called 911 first, with a pack of lies. The officer that responded refused to look at the video footage. Oh well. From time to time, Ima parked a car in front of our house and just sat there and watched us. She'd take photos and videos of us inside our house. She only did that once, after we got the cameras. They are covert, only to a point. If you zoom a camera in on them, you'll see them. She toned down her act after that. Things were quiet for almost a year. Then one night, we heard a loud boom, and the house shook. We peeked out the bedroom window and saw a couple of cars in front of Ima's house and a few people milling around her front yard. We got up and looked at the video footage and saw Ima's son light something and throw it at our house, toward our bedroom. Then the explosion that shook the house. We called the police, but since there were no injuries or damage to the house, only burned up plants in the yard, they wouldn't even file a report. A few days later, we met with a realtor. Psycho neighbor, let's not ever meet again. For a bit of context, I grew up in the middle of a farmland, in a large 1800s Victorian home. Given its history, there has always been several shacks and barns that once belonged to the builder of this house. There is a highway that sees maybe 3 cars on it during the night, and directly across from said highway, about 200 feet inward of a cornfield, is a shack that I have always found creepy. As kids, myself and friends would dare each other to go inside and look, which always ended up with us going as a team. Nothing scary was ever found. Maybe a few broken glasses, metal piles, and miscellaneous items. There was no electricity or any sort of utility that made it homely. Years go by, and the existence of the shack becomes a part of my daily life. However, one particular night, as I was watching TV, I noticed a light going off and on outside of my window. After getting startled, I dismissed it as passing cars, simply more frequent than they typically are. An hour passes. It's nearing midnight, and the light stays on. This time I know for sure it's coming from outside. My family was asleep, but being my pansy 16-year-old self, I needed confirmation. Too bad for me. No one wants to go check it out, so I go alone. I grab my pocket knife and a flashlight, the best I could think of with my shaken thoughts, and take off into the night. As I neared the highway, the light turns off, almost making me choke on air. But I had to figure out what the hell was going on. I make it to the entrance of the shack, which has no door, and slowly begin to enter. My flashlight scanning the room for any sign of life. What happened next, I'll never forget. 5 feet away from me, there's an old tattered recliner, facing away, that my father had tossed in there for future disposal. I shined my light on it, because I knew I'd seen it rock ever so slightly. As I did that, a man stands up from the recliner, saying absolutely nothing. All I could tell was that he was middle-aged and wearing a jacket of sorts. Before I could process what was happening, I was already sprinting across the road and praying he wasn't behind me. It felt like years before I could make it to my door. But as I'm about to make it into safety, I decide to look back. He was standing in the road, completely still. No words whatsoever. It's been 7 years since then. The shack still stands. The recliner remains in place. My dad never believed me. I wish someone could share the dread I had when I realized the recliner was facing a window which was directed straight at my house. Let's not meet again. This all started around December. I'm not sure if I should be contacting the police or anything, but it's quite unnerving. So I stay at my girlfriend's house on the weekends, and she lives on campus at a university. She lives with 2 of her roommates and lives next door to her friends. This one night, I woke up to screaming at 2 a.m. Now, typically, you'd expect to be hearing screaming on campus from people leaving bars late at night. However, this was very different. There was a blood-curdling scream from a girl yelling for her dad. She screamed "Dad" at least 4 times. I don't even know how my girlfriend didn't wake up from this. Then it became quiet, and my heart was pounding. At first, my girlfriend thought I was just having a bad dream, or something like that. But the scream was all too real. This experience was terrifying. But this wasn't the only time someone heard the screaming. About 2 months later, her neighbor texted her in a group chat, asking if anyone heard screaming. And then, exactly a week later, another neighbor heard it as well. Almost exactly another week goes by, and her friend, who lives a couple of streets down, had roommates that texted each other, asking about if they heard the screaming at 2 a.m. At this point, it seems pretty clear. It could be some sort of luring for trafficking. Less than a month later, around 11:30 p.m., my girlfriend's roommate thought she heard a girl screaming, "Get off!" And she looked out the window, but didn't see anything. That was the last time someone heard anything. These events seem very planned, and the fact that my girlfriend lives with 2 other girls alone in a house without a deadlock makes it even worse.
A few years ago, I lived in my car. I was fresh out of college and overwhelmed with student debt. And being young, dumb, and 21, I thought car living was a good way to save money. I live in Southern California, so the rent is high and the weather is temperate enough to make this possible year-round. One night, I decided to park in a neighborhood I thought I knew well. It was right by the beach and a couple blocks next to an ex-boyfriend of mine, so I felt safe there, as I had walked the streets at night plenty of times. I parked, locked the doors, hung up the curtains so no one could look in, plugged in my earplugs so the cars passing wouldn't wake me, and fell asleep. Now my earplugs were effective, but crappy, and I could always count on them falling off in the middle of the night. I actually preferred this because it meant I could fall asleep, but still hear my phone alarm in the morning. It was about 2 a.m. when I woke up to my earplugs already have fallen off, and something feeling wrong. Odd scratching noises were coming from the window. It started at the passenger side door and then moved to the back seat doors. I froze, unsure of what to make of it, painfully aware that I leave my windows slightly cracked at night for ventilation. I honestly didn't know what to do, so I stayed frozen, trying to make sense of it all. That's when the flashlight turned on, and some man unmistakably was shining his light in, trying to find a crack in the curtains, and to my horror, he found one and shined it right where my face was. It's hard to explain, but the position of my head made it so I could piece together what was happening, based on the light everywhere, but he couldn't see my eyes. The scratching then continued, and I knew I was screwed. This went from potential attempted car theft to someone knowing I was in the car. I was literally paralyzed with fear and couldn't will myself to grab the baseball bat that I had. I wish I could say I screamed something truly bad, but what left my lips was a loud, aggravated and forceful, "Excuse me." It was super lame, but it echoed. To my immense relief, I hear the sounds of his footsteps running away at top speed. But I kid you not, the man was laughing as he ran like it was some kind of game. I was still paralyzed, but eventually, him running gave me the courage to get up, grab my bat, and shove my way to the front seat, where I started the car and sped away. I didn't see him, and I spent the night at a friend's house. I live in an apartment now. It wasn't until the next morning I realized I had parked 1 block away from a bar, and, at the time of the incident, the bar had just closed.